She hadn't slept in her own bed for 3 weeks. The leather seats of her Mercedes weren't made for sleeping, but they were all she had left. The parking lot of the 24-hour diner was quiet at 2 a.m., except for the occasional truck driver grabbing coffee for the long haul ahead. She pulled her designer blazer tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the way her stomach growled. The last meal she'd eaten was a stale bagel from a gas station somewhere outside Portland. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was just trying to get home to his daughter. The double shift at the construction site had left his muscles aching and his hands raw, but the overtime pay meant Emma could have those art supplies she'd been asking for. The beat-up pickup truck rattled as he drove through the empty streets, radio playing softly to keep him awake. That's when he saw her. A woman in expensive clothes, curled up in the front seat of a luxury car, looking more broken than anyone in a Mercedes should ever look. Neither of them knew that this moment would shatter everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and what it truly means to have something worth fighting for. Neither of them knew that sometimes the people who look like they have everything are the ones who have lost the most. And neither of them knew that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from having all the answers, but from admitting you don't have any at all. If you believe that every person has a story worth hearing, that kindness can change everything, and that sometimes the most successful people are the ones who've learned to fall gracefully, then you're going to want to hear this story, because this is about more than just a chance encounter in a parking lot. This is about what happens when two worlds collide and neither person walks away unchanged. The fluorescent lights of the diner cast harsh shadows across the parking lot, creating a maze of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the chaos in Sarah Chun's mind. She shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat of her silver Mercedes, the leather that had once felt like luxury now feeling cold and unforgiving against her skin. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:17 a.m., and she wondered if she'd ever sleep properly again. 3 weeks ago, she'd been the CEO of Technova Solutions, a company she'd built from the ground up over 8 years. 3 weeks ago, she'd had a corner office on the 40th floor of downtown Seattle's most prestigious building, a penthouse apartment with a view of the Sound, and a bank account that most people could only dream of. 3 weeks ago, she'd been featured on the cover of Business Weekly with the headline, "The Disruptor: How Sarah Chun Changed Everything." Now she was homeless, nearly broke, and sleeping in her car. The story of how she'd gotten here was one she'd replayed in her mind countless times, each iteration more painful than the last. It had started with Marcus, her business partner, and the man she'd trusted with everything. They'd known each other since college, had built Technova together, had weathered every storm and celebrated every victory side by side, when he'd suggested bringing in outside investors to help them expand internationally. She'd trusted his judgment completely. She should have read the fine print more carefully. She should have questioned why Marcus insisted on handling all the legal negotiations himself. She should have wondered why he'd been so secretive about the investor meetings. But she'd been focused on product development, on innovation, on the things that had made Technova successful in the first place. She'd trusted him to handle the business side while she handled the vision. The betrayal had been swift and brutal. The investors weren't just buying into the company, they were buying Marcus's majority stake, the one he'd quietly accumulated by diluting her shares over the years through a series of complex legal maneuvers she'd been too busy to pay attention to. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The board meeting that was supposed to discuss expansion had instead become a vote of no confidence in her leadership. Marcus had sat across from her at the conference table, his face a mask of professional regret, and explained that the investors felt the company needed fresh leadership to reach its full potential. The man who'd once been her closest friend, who'd eaten ramen with her in her tiny apartment while they coded until dawn, who'd celebrated their first million in revenue with cheap champagne and tears of joy, had sold her out for a bigger piece of the pie. The worst part wasn't even the money, though losing her life savings hurt. The worst part was the way everyone had looked at her afterward, with pity, with confusion, with the kind of uncomfortable sympathy people reserved for those who'd fallen from grace. Former colleagues avoided her calls. Industry contacts suddenly became too busy to meet for coffee. The business community that had once celebrated her as a visionary now whispered about her as a cautionary tale. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller in the seat. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few long-haul truckers grabbing coffee and a couple of teenagers who'd probably been kicked out of wherever they'd been partying. She'd chosen this diner because it was far enough from downtown that she wouldn't run into anyone she knew, but close enough to the library where she'd been spending her days trying to figure out her next move. The legal battle to reclaim her company had drained what little savings she'd had left. Her lawyer had been optimistic at first, talking about breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent misrepresentation, but Marcus had been careful. Every document had been signed, every transaction had been technically legal, every step had been covered by the best corporate lawyers money could buy. She'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd known exactly what she cared about and had used that knowledge against her. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, her heart leaped with the hope that it might be a response to one of the dozens of job applications she'd sent out. Instead, it was her landlord reminding her that the eviction notice would be enforced tomorrow if she didn't pay the 3 months of back rent she owed. She'd already sold her jewelry, her designer clothes, everything of value she'd owned. The Mercedes would be next, but she needed it to get to interviews, to maintain some semblance of professionalism while she tried to rebuild her life. Irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent years giving speeches about entrepreneurship and resilience, about the importance of taking risks and learning from failure. She'd been invited to conferences around the world to talk about innovation and leadership, had been quoted in dozens of articles about breaking barriers in tech. Now she was living in her car, rationing energy bars and trying to figure out which gym membership she could afford so she'd have a place to shower. A knock on her window made her jump, her heart racing as she looked up to see a man standing outside her car. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His face was kind but concerned, and he held his hands up in a gesture of peace when he saw her startled expression. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I saw you sitting here when I went into the diner, and you're still here now. I was worried something might be wrong." Sarah's first instinct was to tell him she was fine, to start the car and drive away before he could ask any more questions. She'd become an expert at deflecting concern over the past few weeks, at maintaining the facade that she was just temporarily inconvenienced rather than fundamentally broken. But there was something about the way he'd approached her cautious, but caring, respectful but genuinely worried, that made her hesitate. She rolled down the window a few inches, just enough to talk without feeling completely exposed. "I'm okay," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Just taking a break from driving." The man nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Are you sure? I don't mean to be nosy, but I've been working construction for 15 years, and I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere else to go. If you need help, I don't need help," Sarah said quickly, the words sharp with pride and desperation. "I'm fine, really." He studied her for a moment, and she could see him taking in the details, the expensive car, the designer clothes that were now wrinkled from sleeping in them, the way she held herself like someone who wasn't used to being vulnerable. "Okay," he said finally. "But if you change your mind, I'm David. I'll be in the diner for another few minutes." He started to walk away, then turned back. Listen, I don't know what's going on, but whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone help you. Sarah watched him walk back toward the diner, his words echoing in her mind. She'd spent so many years being the one who helped others, who solved problems, who had all the answers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The idea of accepting help from a stranger felt foreign and terrifying. But as she sat there in the cold car, with nowhere to go and no one to call, she realized that maybe she'd been wrong about what strength really meant. David Martinez had been working construction since he was 18, and in all those years, he'd learned to read people the way other men read blueprints. The woman in the Mercedes wasn't just tired, she was haunted. There was something about the way she held herself, the carefully controlled desperation in her voice, that reminded him of his own dark days after his wife died. He'd been on his way home from another double shift, his muscles aching and his mind already focused on the morning routine with his daughter Emma. At 9 years old, she was his entire world, the reason he got up every morning and the motivation behind every extra hour he worked. The construction job paid well enough to keep them comfortable, but it was the overtime that allowed him to save for her college fund and buy her the art supplies she loved so much. The drive home from the job site usually took him through the nicer part of town, past the office buildings and upscale restaurants that catered to the kind of people who made more in a year than he'd see in a decade. He'd never felt bitter about the inequality. He'd chosen his path, and he was proud of the honest work he did. But seeing the woman in the Mercedes had triggered something in him, a recognition of pain that transcended economic boundaries. Inside the diner, he ordered his usual black coffee and a piece of pie he'd take home for Emma's breakfast, and found himself glancing out the window at the parking lot. The woman was still there, still sitting in her car like she was trying to disappear. The server, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who'd been working the night shift for as long as David could remember, followed his gaze. "She's been coming here for about a week," Ruth said quietly. "Orders a cup of coffee and makes it last for hours. Always sits in the corner booth, always alone. Pays with cash, exact change. Yesterday she asked if we had any job openings." David looked at Ruth with surprise. "Job openings here?" Ruth nodded. "Said she had restaurant experience, which I doubt looking at her clothes, but she seemed desperate. Manager wasn't interested, said she didn't look like she'd last a day on her feet, but I could see it in her eyes, you know. The same look my sister had when her husband left her with nothing but debt and 2 kids to raise." David sipped his coffee, thinking about the woman's defensive response when he'd offered help. He'd seen that same pride in the mirror during the months after Maria's death, when well-meaning neighbors had brought casseroles and offers of assistance that he'd politely declined. It had taken him a long time to understand that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a recognition of common humanity. "She's sleeping in her car," he said, more to himself than to Ruth. Ruth's expression softened. "I figured as much. She's been here every night this week, leaving just before dawn. Comes back in the afternoon, orders that 1 cup of coffee, and tries to make it last. Yesterday she asked if she could use the Wi-Fi to send emails." David pulled out his wallet and placed a 20 on the counter. "Can you do me a favor? Next time she comes in, tell her the coffee's on the house. And maybe see if she wants some food on my tab." Ruth smiled. "You're a good man, David Martinez. But you can't save everyone." "I'm not trying to save anyone," David replied. "Just trying to be the kind of person my daughter can be proud of." He took his pie and headed for the door, but something made him pause. Through the window, he could see the woman in the Mercedes, and for the first time, he noticed that she was crying. Not the dramatic sobbing of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who'd been holding it together. For too long, David had been that person once. After Maria's death, he'd spent months going through the motions of living while feeling completely empty inside. He'd drop Emma off at school, go to work, come home, make dinner, help with homework, and put her to bed, all while feeling like he was watching his life from outside his body. It had been Emma who'd saved him, her innocent questions and unconditional love gradually pulling him back to himself. But this woman didn't seem to have anyone. She was alone in a way that went beyond just being by herself. She was isolated, cut off from whatever support system she'd once had. David knew that kind of alone, and he knew how dangerous it could be. He walked back to his truck, but instead of driving away, he sat there for a moment, watching the woman in the Mercedes. She'd stopped crying and was now staring straight ahead, her face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. David thought about Emma, about the conversation they'd had just last week about kindness and helping others. Emma had been working on a school project about community helpers, and she'd asked him why he always stopped to help people whose cars had broken down on the highway. He'd tried to explain that everyone deserved help when they needed it, that you never knew what someone else was going through, that sometimes a small act of kindness could change everything. But what if they don't want help? Emma had asked with the directness that only children possess. Then you respect that, David had replied. But you make sure they know the offer is real. Now sitting in his truck in the diner parking lot, David realized he hadn't followed his own advice. He'd offered help once, been turned down, and walked away. But the woman in the Mercedes was still there, still alone, still clearly in need of something, even if she couldn't admit it. He got out of his truck and walked back to her car, this time approaching more slowly. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he could see the wariness in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope that she was trying hard to suppress. "I'm sorry to bother you again," David said, keeping his voice gentle. "I just wanted you to know that I meant what I said about helping. I'm not trying to be a hero or anything. I just know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Sarah looked at him through the window, seeing something in his expression that made her defenses waver. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a quiet understanding that spoke to something deep inside her. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "You're right," David agreed. "I don't know your story. But I know what it looks like when someone's trying to be strong for so long that they've forgotten it's okay to be human. I know what it looks like when someone's pride is the only thing keeping them from falling apart completely." Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered. "I'm supposed to be successful. I'm supposed to have my life together." "Says who?" David asked. The question caught her off guard. "Says everyone. Says the magazines that wrote about me, the people who looked up to me, the employees who trusted me to lead them. I was the CEO of a tech company. I was supposed to be a role model." David nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I'm nothing," Sarah said, the words coming out like a confession. "I lost everything. My company, my home, my savings, my reputation. I'm sleeping in my car and applying for jobs at fast food restaurants. I'm a failure." "No," David said firmly. "You're not a failure. You're a person who's going through a hard time. There's a difference." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "How can you say that?" "You don't even know what I did wrong." "Because failing at something doesn't make you a failure," David replied. "It makes you human. And sometimes being human means acknowledging that you can't do everything alone." The simplicity of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on rebuilding her empire, on proving that she could bounce back from anything, that she'd forgotten the most basic truth of human existence, that everyone needs help sometimes, and that needing help didn't diminish her worth as a person. "I don't know how to not be successful," she admitted. "I've been achieving things since I was 5 years old. I've never not had a plan, never not known what my next move would be. I don't know how to be this person. David smiled gently. Maybe that's exactly what you need to learn. Maybe the person you're becoming is more important than the person you used to be. Sarah stared at him, seeing something in his face that she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine compassion without agenda, kindness without expectation of return. "Why do you care?" she asked. "Why are you standing here talking to a stranger in a parking lot at 2 in the morning? Because 3 years ago, I was in a different kind of car in a different parking lot, and I was just as lost as you are." David said, "Because someone helped me when I needed it, and I learned that the only way to honor that help is to pass it on. Because my daughter is watching how I treat other people, and I want her to grow up knowing that everyone deserves compassion." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of something she'd almost forgotten: relief. Relief that someone had seen her pain and hadn't turned away. Relief that she didn't have to carry the weight of her failure alone. Relief that maybe, just maybe, she was still worth saving. "I don't know where to start," she said quietly. "Start by getting out of this car," David said. "Come inside, have some coffee, and we'll figure out the rest from there." Sarah looked at the diner with its harsh fluorescent lights and worn vinyl booths, and realized that it looked warmer than anywhere she'd been in weeks. She looked at David, this stranger who'd seen her at her lowest point and offered kindness instead of judgment, and made a decision that would change everything. She turned off the engine and opened the car door. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a few truckers nursing coffee and a cook visible through the service window. Ruth, the night shift waitress, looked up as David walked in with Sarah, her expression warming with understanding. She led them to a corner booth, the same one Sarah had occupied during her previous visits, and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. "Cream and sugar?" Ruth asked Sarah, who nodded gratefully. As they settled into the booth, Sarah felt the strangeness of the situation washing over her. A week ago, she'd been living in a world of boardrooms and business lunches, of quarterly reports and strategic planning sessions. Now she was sitting in an all-night diner with a construction worker who'd shown her more kindness than anyone in her professional network had in months. "So," David said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, "what's your story? And don't give me the PR version. Give me the real one." Sarah looked at him, seeing the genuine interest in his eyes, and found herself wanting to tell the truth. For the first time in weeks. "My name is Sarah Chun," she began. "And until 3 weeks ago, I was living what I thought was the perfect life." She told him about Technova, about the years of 16-hour days and the satisfaction of building something from nothing. She told him about Marcus, about the betrayal that had come not from an enemy, but from her closest friend. She told him about the legal battles, the financial ruin, the slow realization that the life she'd built was more fragile than she'd ever imagined. David listened without interruption, his expression growing more concerned as the story unfolded. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, processing what she'd told him. "That's a hell of a thing to go through," he said finally. "Especially alone." "I brought it on myself," Sarah said automatically. "I should have been more careful, should have paid attention to the contracts, should have seen it coming." Should have, David repeated. "You sound like me after my wife died. I should have insisted she see a doctor sooner, should have recognized the symptoms, should have done something different. But you know what I learned? Should have doesn't change what happened. It just makes you carry guilt that isn't yours to carry." Sarah looked at him with new eyes. "Your wife died?" David nodded. "Cancer, 3 years ago. She was 31 years old, and she left me with a 6-year-old daughter and no idea how to be a single parent. I spent months thinking about all the things I should have done differently, all the ways I could have prevented it. It nearly destroyed me." "How did you get through it?" Sarah asked. "I realized that surviving wasn't enough," David said. "I had to learn to live again." And the first step was admitting that I couldn't do it alone. Sarah stared into her coffee, seeing her reflection in the dark surface. I don't know how to not be in control, she admitted. I've been making decisions and solving problems since I was a kid. Even when I was broke and living on ramen in college, I knew where I was going. This is the first time in my life that I literally don't know what my next move should be. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, David suggested. Maybe the person you were before was so busy planning the next move that she forgot to pay attention to what was happening right in front of her. Sarah looked up at him sharply. Are you saying I deserved what happened to me? Not at all, David said quickly. What happened to you was wrong, and the person who did it should be held accountable. But I'm saying that maybe this is a chance to figure out who you are when you're not defined by your job title or your bank account. Sarah felt a flash of anger. Easy for you to say you didn't lose everything you worked for. You're right, David said calmly. I didn't lose a company. I lost a wife. I lost the mother of my child. I lost my best friend and my future and my sense of who I was supposed to be. Different losses, same devastation. The anger drained out of Sarah as quickly as it had come. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to minimize what you went through. And I'm not trying to minimize what you're going through, David replied. I'm just saying that rock bottom can be a foundation if you let it be. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Ruth refilled their coffee cups and left a slice of pie on the table without comment. The diner's ambient noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet conversation between truckers, created a cocoon of normalcy that Sarah hadn't experienced in weeks. Tell me about your daughter, Sarah said finally, wanting to shift the conversation away from loss and towards something that might bring light to David's eyes. David's entire expression changed, a smile spreading across his face like sunrise. Emma is 9 years old, and she's the smartest, funniest, most artistic kid you've ever met. She wants to be an animator for Pixar, and she's already better at drawing than I'll ever be. She's also the reason I get up every morning and the reason I work as hard as I do. It must be hard, raising her alone, Sarah said. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, David admitted, but also the most rewarding. She's taught me more about resilience than I ever taught her. Kids have this amazing ability to find joy even in difficult circumstances. When Maria died, Emma was sad, but she was also worried about me. A 6-year-old was trying to take care of her father because she could see that he was falling apart. Sarah felt her throat tighten. That must have been heartbreaking. It was a wake-up call, David said. I realized that I had a choice. I could let grief consume me, or I could honor Maria's memory by being the father Emma needed. I chose to live. Sarah studied David's face, seeing the strength that had been forged in the fire of loss. How did you do it? How did you make that choice? One day at a time, David said. One decision at a time. And I had help from friends, from family, from strangers who showed me kindness when I needed it most. The hardest part was learning to accept that help, learning that needing support didn't make me weak. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. I've been trying to solve this like a business problem, she said. Like if I just worked hard enough, planned well enough, I could rebuild everything exactly the way it was before. And now? David asked. Now I'm wondering if maybe the way it was before wasn't as perfect as I thought it was, Sarah admitted. I was so focused on success that I forgot about everything else. I didn't have close friends, didn't have hobbies, didn't have a life outside of work. When I lost the company, I lost everything because the company was everything, David nodded. Success is a funny thing. We spend so much time chasing it that we forget to ask what we're really chasing. Money, recognition, power, or just the feeling that we matter. Sarah considered this. I think I was chasing proof that I was worth something, that I mattered, that I deserved to take up space in the world. And now that you've lost those external markers of worth, what do you think? David asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, really thinking about the question. I don't know, she said finally. I've been so angry and so scared that I haven't had space to think about anything else. But talking to you sitting here in this diner at 3 in the morning, I feel more like myself than I have in weeks. Maybe that's because this is the first time in a long time that you've been yourself, instead of trying to be what you think others expect, David suggested. Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the worn vinyl booths, the flickering fluorescent lights, the simple honesty of the place. I used to eat in restaurants that cost more per meal than most people make in a day, she said. I thought that was what success looked like. But I was always performing, always being the version of myself that I thought would impress others. And how does it feel to not be performing? David asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. Terrifying, she said. But also liberating? Like I can finally stop pretending to have all the answers. David smiled. That's the beginning of wisdom right there, admitting that you don't have all the answers. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it and saw another rejection email from a job application, this one from a position she'd been particularly hopeful about. The familiar wave of disappointment washed over her, but this time it was tempered by something else, a growing understanding that maybe she'd been applying for the wrong kinds of jobs. Bad news? David asked, noticing her expression. Another rejection, Sarah said. I've been applying for executive positions, trying to get back to where I was before. But every interview, I can see them thinking the same thing. If she was so successful, why is she here? Why doesn't she have a job already? Maybe because you're not the same person you were before, David suggested. Maybe you need to figure out who you are now before you can figure out what you want to do. Sarah stared at him, the truth of his words hitting her with surprising force. I've been so focused on rebuilding my old life that I never considered building a new one. Exactly, David said. And maybe the new one could be better than the old one, even if it looks different. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of anxiety and desperation that had been her constant companion for weeks. I don't know what a new life would look like, she said. I don't know who I am without the company, without the title, without the success. Then maybe it's time to find out, David said. But you don't have to figure it out all at once. You just need to take the first step. What would that be? Sarah asked. David smiled. Getting a good night's sleep somewhere other than your car. Sarah laughed, and the sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd genuinely laughed, the last time something had felt genuinely funny instead of bitter or ironic. I can't afford a hotel room, she said. I'm literally down to my last few $100s. I wasn't talking about a hotel, David said. I was talking about the guest room in my house. Emma and I have more space than we need, and I'd rather have you safe and warm than sleeping in a parking lot. Sarah stared at him, shocked by the generosity of the offer. You don't even know me, she said. For all you know, I could be dangerous. David chuckled. I'm pretty sure I can handle the exhausted CEO who's been living on gas station coffee and energy bars. But why would you do that? Sarah asked. Why would you invite a stranger into your home? Because that's what people do for each other. David said simply, because I have the space and you need it. Because 3 years ago, a stranger invited me and Emma for dinner when I was too overwhelmed to cook, and it saved us both from a night of grief and takeout. Because kindness is supposed to be passed on, not hoarded. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. I don't know how to repay you, she said. You don't have to repay me, David said. You just have to accept the help and maybe someday pass it on to someone else who needs it. Sarah looked at this man who'd found her at her lowest point and offered her exactly what she needed, not solutions or advice or pity, but simple human kindness. She thought about her old life, about the careful networking and strategic relationships that had defined her professional world. None of those people had reached out when she'd fallen. None of them had offered help when she'd needed it most. But this stranger, this construction worker she'd met in a diner parking lot, had seen her pain and responded with compassion. He'd offered her shelter without expecting anything in return, had listened to her story without judgment, had reminded her that her worth wasn't tied to her net worth. "Okay," Sarah said quietly. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble." "It's not trouble at all," David said. "But I should warn you, Emma is going to be very curious about you. She's never met a CEO before, and she's going to have a lot of questions." Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "I think I'd like to meet her too. It's been a long time since I talked to someone who wasn't trying to sell me something or get something from me." "Emma's definitely not trying to sell you anything," David said with a grin. "Though she might try to show you every single drawing she's ever made. Fair warning, there are a lot of them." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave the diner, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to the wreckage of their old life, but the quiet hope of someone beginning to imagine a new one. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how she'd rebuild her life or even what that rebuilt life would look like. But for the first time since Marcus's betrayal, she felt like she wasn't facing the future alone. The drive to David's house was quiet, Sarah following his taillights through the empty streets. She looked at the houses they passed, modest homes with small yards and cars that had seen better days, and realized that she was entering a world she'd never really understood despite her success in business. As they pulled into the driveway of a small blue house with a bike in the front yard and children's artwork visible through the windows, Sarah felt nervous for the first time all evening. She'd been comfortable in the diner, comfortable in the anonymous space where she could be honest about her failures. But entering David's home felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. David seemed to sense her hesitation as they stood on the front porch. "It's not much," he said, echoing words she'd heard before in different contexts. "But it's home." Sarah looked at the welcome mat, at the small wind chimes hanging from the porch roof, at the child's drawing taped to the window, and realized that this modest house radiated something her expensive penthouse had never possessed: warmth. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. As David opened the front door and gestured for her to enter, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the first real home she'd experienced in longer than she cared to remember. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in weeks, she was ready to find out. The first thing Sarah noticed about David's house wasn't the modest furniture or the children's toys scattered across the living room floor. It was the photographs. They were everywhere: on the mantel, the side tables, the refrigerator door, capturing moments of ordinary joy that felt revolutionary to someone who'd spent years documenting her life through corporate headshots and professional achievements. In the largest frame on the mantel, a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile held a chubby-cheeked toddler, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. Sarah recognized the expression on David's face as he noticed her looking at the photo, the particular mix of love and loss that came with cherishing memories while learning to live without them. "That's Maria," David said softly, moving to stand beside Sarah, "and Emma when she was 3. Maria always said Emma got her artistic talent and my stubborn streak." Sarah studied the photograph, seeing the happiness that radiated from the captured moment. "She was beautiful," she said, meaning it. "She was," David agreed, "but more than that, she was good. The kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought soup to sick neighbors, who saw the best in people even when they couldn't see it themselves." The house itself bore the marks of a life lived fully but simply. The couch showed wear from countless movie nights. The coffee table had water rings from forgotten drinks. And the walls displayed Emma's artwork with the pride typically reserved for gallery pieces. It was the kind of home that had been built. Not with money, but with attention. Not with expensive items, but with care. "I should check on Emma," David said, glancing toward the hallway. "She's a deep sleeper, but I want to make sure she's okay before I get you settled in." Sarah nodded, watching him disappear down the hallway with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been navigating single parenthood for years. She found herself alone in the living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life so different from her. Owned that it might as well have been from another planet. Her penthouse apartment had been featured in Architectural Digest, all clean lines and expensive materials, curated to perfection by a designer who'd charged more for a single room than most people made in a year. But standing in David's living room, Sarah realized that her beautiful apartment had never felt like a home. It had been a showcase, a statement, a reflection of her success rather than her soul. She moved closer to the photographs, studying the progression of Emma's growth from toddler to child. There were birthday parties with homemade cakes, Halloween costumes that were clearly handmade, Christmas mornings with presents wrapped in newspaper comics. Each image told a story of love, expressed through presence rather than presence, of wealth measured in moments rather than money. One photograph caught her attention: Emma, probably around age 7, standing proudly next to a small garden patch, dirt under her fingernails and a gap-toothed grin on her face. Behind her, tomato plants climbed makeshift trellises and sunflowers stretched toward the camera. It was the kind of simple summer moment that Sarah had never experienced, even as a child. Her own childhood had been structured around achievement. Piano lessons, advanced math classes, summer programs designed to give her an edge in college admissions. Her parents, both successful professionals, had meant well, but they'd raised her to believe that worth was earned through accomplishment rather than simply existing. "She's still asleep," David said, returning to the living room. "But I left a note on her nightstand explaining that we have a guest, so she won't be confused when she wakes up." Sarah turned from the photographs, feeling like she'd been caught. Examining someone's private diary. "I hope I'm not imposing. I don't want to disrupt her routine." David smiled. "Trust me, Emma loves meeting new people. She's going to be thrilled to have someone to show her art to who isn't me. I run out of new compliments after a while." He led her down the hallway, past Emma's room with its door slightly ajar, past a bathroom with a rubber duck still sitting on the edge of the tub, to a small guest room at the end of the hall. The space was simple but comfortable, with a twin bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a small nightstand with a reading lamp, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. "It's not fancy," David said, echoing his earlier words about the house. "But the bed is comfortable, and you'll have privacy. The bathroom is across the hall, and there are clean towels in the closet." Sarah looked around the room, taking in the care that had gone into making it welcoming. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand, clearly picked from the garden she'd seen in the photograph. The quilt was faded but obviously loved, the kind of handmade item that carried the warmth of its creator. On the wall hung a small framed watercolor of a mountain sunrise, painted with the enthusiastic imperfection of a child's hand. "Emma painted that," David said, noticing her gaze. "She said every room needs something beautiful to look at." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "She's right," she managed to say. "This is perfect. More than perfect." David studied her face, seeing the genuine gratitude there. "When's the last time you had a real night's sleep?" he asked. Sarah had to think about it. "I don't know. Even before I lost the company, I was working 18-hour days. I'd gotten used to functioning on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and these past few weeks in the car." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how exhausted she actually was. Then, Sleep, David said simply. As late as you want. Emma and I are early risers, but we'll keep quiet until you're ready to join the world. Sarah nodded, feeling tears threatening again. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You don't even know me, and you're showing me more kindness than people I've known for years. That says more about the people you've known than it does about me, David replied. This is just what people do for each other. Or what they should do anyway. After David left her alone, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process the strangeness of her situation. 24 hours ago, she'd been sleeping in her car, certain that her life was over. Now she was in the guest room of a stranger's house, feeling safer than she had in months. She pulled out her phone and looked at the screen, realizing that for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the compulsive need to check her emails or scroll through social media. The constant anxiety that had been her companion since Marcus's betrayal seemed to have quieted, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed: peace. Sarah changed into the spare clothes from her car and lay down on the comfortable bed, pulling the handmade quilt up to her chin. Through the window, she could see the outline of the garden Emma had been so proud of in the photograph, now dormant for winter, but still holding the promise of spring's renewal. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking not about the company she'd lost or the future she'd have to rebuild, but about the man who'd found her at her lowest point and responded with simple human decency. She'd spent years networking with powerful people, building relationships that were really transactions in disguise. But David had offered her something she'd never experienced in her professional life: kindness without agenda. For the first time in weeks, Sarah slept without nightmares. She woke to the sound of quiet laughter drifting through the house, mixed with the clatter of dishes and the gentle hum of a radio playing softly in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, and Sarah realized with surprise that she'd slept for nearly 10 hours straight. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of a family beginning their day. There was something musical about it, the rhythm of familiar routines, the harmony of voices that knew each other completely. It was so different from the sterile silence of her apartment, where the only sounds had been the hum of expensive appliances and the distant traffic of the city below. Sarah checked her phone and saw that it was almost 9 o'clock. In her old life, she would have been in the office for 3 hours already, would have already attended 2 meetings and answered dozens of emails. The thought of missing so much of the day would have filled her with anxiety. Instead, she felt rested for the first time in months. She got dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, following the sound of voices and the smell of something. That might have been pancakes. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. David stood at the stove, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, flipping pancakes with the casual competence of someone who'd been making breakfast for years. At the kitchen table, a girl with dark hair and bright eyes was arranging colored pencils in a precise pattern while working on what appeared to be an elaborate drawing of a dragon. "Good morning," David said, looking up as Sarah entered the room. "I was wondering when you'd surface. Emma's been asking about you since she woke up." Emma looked up from her drawing, studying Sarah with the frank curiosity of a child. "Are you the lady who was sleeping in her car?" she asked with the directness that only 9-year-olds possess. "Emma," David said in a gentle warning tone. "It's okay," Sarah said, sitting down across from Emma at the table. "Yes, I was sleeping in my car. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do until they can figure out something better." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Dad says you used to be in charge of a big company. Like a boss?" Sarah smiled. "Something like that. I helped people create computer programs and websites." "Cool," Emma said, clearly impressed. "Can you make video games?" "I never made video games specifically," Sarah admitted. "But I know people who do. The company I used to work for made programs that helped other companies manage their information. Emma's interest in the technical details waned quickly, but her curiosity about Sarah remained. "Are you sad about losing your company?" she asked. The question was so simple and direct that Sarah found herself answering honestly. "Yes," she said. "I am sad. I worked very hard to build that company, and it was important to me. When my mom died, I was really sad too," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Dad said it was okay to be sad. That sadness means you loved something a lot." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Your dad is a very wise man," she said softly. Emma beamed. He makes the best pancakes too. Are you hungry?" "Dad made extra because he said you probably haven't been eating very well." Sarah looked at David, who was now plating pancakes with the same care he seemed to bring to everything else. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You're not imposing," David said firmly. "You're joining us for breakfast. There's a difference." As they ate, Sarah found herself drawn into the easy rhythm of the family's morning routine. Emma chattered about her school day ahead, about the art project she was working on, about the book she was reading. David listened with the attention of someone who genuinely cared about his daughter's world, asking questions and offering encouragement with the patience that only love could provide. "What do you do for work?" Emma asked Sarah between bites. "Of pancake. Right now I'm looking for a new job," Sarah said. "I'm not sure what I want to do next." "You could work at my school," Emma suggested. "Mrs. Patterson is always saying they need help with the computers." Sarah smiled. "That's a good idea. I'll think about it." After Emma left for school, her backpack loaded with books and art supplies, Sarah found herself alone with David in the kitchen. The house felt different without Emma's bright energy, quieter but still warm. "She's amazing," Sarah said, helping David clear the dishes. "So confident and kind. You've done a wonderful job with her." David's expression softened. "She's been my teacher as much as I've been hers. Kids have this way of cutting through all the complications adults create and getting straight to what matters." "She seems to have adjusted well to losing her mother," Sarah observed. David nodded, but Sarah could see the complexity in his expression. "She has good days and bad days. We both do. But she's resilient in ways I never knew were possible." "When Maria first got sick, I was terrified about how Emma would handle it, but she was braver than I was. How do you do it?" Sarah asked. "How do you raise a child alone while dealing with your own grief?" David finished loading the dishwasher and turned to face her. "You take it one day at a time," he said. "Some days you fake it until you make it. Some days you cry in the shower so your kid doesn't see. And some days you realize that being a parent means being the adult your child needs, even when you don't feel like you have anything left to give." Sarah studied his face, seeing the strength that had been forged through necessity. "I don't know if I could do what you've done," she said. "You could," David said with certainty. "People are stronger than they think they are. You've already proven that by surviving what you've been through." "I don't feel like I've survived," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I've just been existing, going through the motions of trying to rebuild something that maybe wasn't worth rebuilding in the first place." David poured himself a cup of coffee and offered one to Sarah. "What do you mean?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth of the mug to center herself. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about success and what we're really chasing. I built Tech Nova because I wanted to prove something to my parents, to the world, to myself. But I never asked if what I was building was actually making me happy. And was it?" David asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "For a while, yes. Or at least I thought it was. The early days were exciting. Building something from nothing, solving problems, creating jobs for people. But somewhere along the way, it became more about the recognition than the work itself." "What changed?" "I think I did," Sarah said. "Success became addictive. The media attention, the speaking engagements, the respect from my peers. It all became part of my identity. I wasn't just Sarah Chun anymore. I was Sarah Chun, CEO, and when I lost the company, I lost myself. David nodded. I went through something similar after Maria died. I'd been David Martinez, Maria's husband, for so long that I didn't know who I was without her. I had to learn to be just David again. How did you do it? I started paying attention to the things that remained constant, David said. My love for Emma, my enjoyment of building things with my hands, my appreciation for simple pleasures. I realized that my core self hadn't changed. I'd just forgotten how to access it. Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking in the evidence of a life lived with intention. The children's artwork on the refrigerator, the coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" printed on it, the small herb garden growing on the windowsill. Your life seems so grounded, she said. So real. It is real, David agreed. But it's also hard. There are days when I worry about money, when I feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising Emma alone, when I wonder if I'm doing enough for her. But those worries are about real things, not about image or perception. I've been worrying about image and perception for so long that I've forgotten what real problems feel like, Sarah said. Even now, part of me is thinking about how to spin this experience if anyone asks. How to make losing everything sound like a strategic pivot. David smiled. What would happen if you just told the truth? The truth? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is that I trusted the wrong person and lost everything. The truth is that I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot to pay attention to the people I was building it with. The truth is that I'm 34 years old and I have no idea who I am without my job title. That's not such a terrible truth, David said. It's honest. It's human. It's something most people could relate to. Sarah stared at him. You really believe that? I know it, David said. Because I've been there. Maybe not with a company, but with the feeling of losing everything that defined me. The people who matter won't judge you for being human. And the people who do judge me, they were never really your friends anyway, David said simply. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and fear she'd been carrying. I've been so afraid of people finding out that I failed, she said. I've been hiding, lying, pretending that I'm still in control. And how has that worked out for you? Sarah laughed, and this time there was genuine humor in it. Not well. I've been more isolated than I've ever been in my life. So maybe it's time to try something different, David suggested. Maybe it's time to be honest about where you are and see who shows up to help. Sarah looked at this man who'd shown up to help her, who'd extended kindness without knowing her story, who'd offered shelter without expecting anything in return. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, David said. It's just not easy. There's a difference. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. David answered it, and Sarah could hear the voice of a woman on the other end, speaking rapidly. David's expression grew concerned. I'll be right there, he said, hanging up. I'm sorry, but I have to go. That was Emma's school. She's in the nurse's office with a stomach ache. Is she okay? Sarah asked, immediately worried. Probably just nerves, David said, already grabbing his keys. She has a big art presentation today, and sometimes she gets anxious. But I need to go check on her. Of course, Sarah said. I'll just... She paused, realizing she didn't know what she should do. In her old life, she would have gone to her office, would have had a schedule full of meetings and obligations. Now she had nowhere to go and nothing to do. David seemed to understand her uncertainty. Make yourself at home, he said. There's food in the fridge, coffee in the pot. I'll be back as soon as I can. After he left, Sarah found herself alone. In the house, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life so different from her own. She wandered through the rooms, not snooping but simply observing, trying to understand how people lived when they weren't constantly performing success. In the living room, she found a bookshelf filled with an eclectic mix of titles, classic literature next to children's books, home improvement manuals next to poetry collections. On the coffee table, a jigsaw puzzle was half finished, its pieces scattered in organized chaos. Sarah had never done a jigsaw puzzle in her life. She sat down on the couch and picked up a piece, studying its shape and colors. It was part of a mountain scene, all blues and greens and the kind of natural beauty she'd admired in photographs, but never experienced firsthand. She tried to fit it into the growing picture, feeling a small satisfaction when it clicked into place. As she worked on the puzzle, Sarah found her mind quieting in a way it hadn't in years. The simple task of matching colors and shapes required attention but not stress, focus but not anxiety. It was meditative in a way that expensive spa treatments had never been. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sarah's stomach clenched with automatic anxiety. But instead of a rejection from a job application or a demand from a creditor, it was a message from David. "Emma's fine. Just nervous about her presentation. Will be home in about an hour." Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath, waiting for bad news that hadn't come. She was so accustomed to crisis, to constant emergency, that normalcy felt foreign. The idea that someone would simply update her on their whereabouts, that she was now part of a circle of people who cared about each other's well-being, was both comforting and overwhelming. She returned to the puzzle, finding a strange peace in the simple task. As she worked, she thought about the conversation she'd had with David that morning, about truth and honesty and the courage it took to be vulnerable. She'd spent so many years building walls around her true self, protecting her image and her reputation, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be human. When David and Emma returned, Sarah was still on the couch, having made significant progress on the mountain scene. Emma burst through the door with the energy of a child who'd conquered her fears. "I did it," she announced. "I gave my presentation about famous artists, and everyone said it was really good." "That's wonderful," Sarah said, genuinely pleased. "What artist did you choose?" "Frida Kahlo," Emma said, settling onto the couch next to Sarah. "She painted even when she was sick and sad. Dad says that's what real artists do, they create beauty even when life is hard." Sarah looked at David, who was watching his daughter with obvious pride. "That's a very wise lesson," she said. "Are you working on our puzzle?" Emma asked, noticing the progress Sarah had made. "I hope that's okay," Sarah said. "I've never done a jigsaw puzzle before, and I found it surprisingly relaxing." Emma's eyes widened. "Never? Not even when you were a kid?" "I was usually too busy with other activities," Sarah explained. "My parents kept me pretty scheduled." "That's sad," Emma said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Puzzles are fun. They teach you patience and how to see how all the pieces fit together," Sarah smiled. "I'm learning that." They spent the rest of the afternoon working on the puzzle together, Emma chattering about her day while David prepared dinner. Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the family's routine, contributing to conversations about school and friends and the small dramas of 9-year-old life. When dinner was ready, they sat around the same table where Sarah had eaten breakfast, but this time she felt less like a guest and more like a temporary member of the family. Emma showed her the drawing she'd been working on that morning. Dragon was now complete, breathing fire that looked like a rainbow. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, studying the intricate details. "You're very talented." "Dad says everyone has talents," Emma said. "They just have to figure out what they are." "What's your talent?" Sarah paused, realizing she didn't have a ready answer. "I used to think it was running a company," she said. "But maybe I need to discover what my other talents are." "You're good at puzzles," Emma pointed out. "And you're a good listener. Those are talents too." After Emma went to bed, David and Sarah found themselves back in the living room, the puzzle now nearly complete. The mountain scene was coming together, revealing itself to be a sunrise over a lake, the kind of peaceful vista that spoke of quiet, mornings and simple pleasures. "Thank you," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "for everything. For last night, for this morning, for letting me be part of your family's day." "You don't have to thank me," David said. "This is what people do for each other." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This is what good people do for each other. I'm learning that there's a difference." They worked on the puzzle together, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same piece. Sarah found herself studying David's profile as he concentrated on the task, seeing the kindness in his expression, the gentleness in his movements. He was nothing like the men she'd dated in her previous life-driven executives who saw relationships as another form of networking, who measured success by the same metrics she'd once used. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Of course. Why did you stop for me that night? I mean, really." Most people would have just driven past. David considered the question seriously. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "I think it was because I recognized something in you. The same thing I saw in my own reflection for months after Maria died." "What was that?" "Someone who was drowning but trying to look like they were swimming," David said. "Someone who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I was drowning," she admitted. "I am drowning. I've been so focused on not looking weak that I forgot that asking for help is actually a form of strength. The strongest people I know are the ones who've learned to accept help when they need it," David said. "It takes courage to admit that you can't do everything alone." "I've never been good at that," Sarah said. "Even as a kid, I was the one who helped other people. I was the one with the answers, the one who solved problems. I didn't know how to be the one who needed help. And now?" Sarah looked around the room, taking in the evidence of a life lived with intention and care. "Now I'm learning that maybe needing help is just part of being human. And maybe the people who are willing to help are the ones worth knowing." They finished the puzzle together, placing the final piece as the clock struck 11. The completed image was beautiful, a perfect sunrise over a perfect lake, the kind of scene that promised new beginnings and fresh starts. "It's finished," Emma said, and Sarah realized she'd been standing in the doorway, watching them work. "Emma, you should be in bed," David said, but his tone was gentle. "I wanted to see if you finished it," Emma said, coming to stand beside the couch. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah looked at the completed puzzle, then at the little girl who'd welcomed her into her home without question, then at the man who'd shown her that kindness wasn't a transaction, but a gift. "It really is," she said, as Emma hugged her father. "Good night," she turned to Sarah. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" she asked. Sarah looked at David, seeing the invitation in his eyes. "If it's okay with your dad," she said. "It's more than okay," David said. "It's welcome." After Emma went to bed, David and Sarah sat in the living room, the completed puzzle between them like a metaphor for the way broken things could be made whole again with patience and care. "I have a confession," Sarah said. "I've been thinking about what you said about being honest, about telling the truth instead of spinning everything. And I realized that I want to try that." "What would that look like?" David asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But I think it starts with admitting that I don't have all the answers, that I'm not the person I thought I was. That maybe losing everything was the only way I could find out who I really am." David nodded. "That's a brave thing to admit." "I don't feel brave," Sarah said. "I feel terrified, but I also feel hopeful, like maybe there's a version of my life that I haven't imagined yet. What would that version look like?" Sarah considered the question, looking around the room that had become a sanctuary. "I think it would be smaller," she said. "More focused on people than on achievements. more focused on connection than on success. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive, David pointed out. No, Sarah agreed. But I think I've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. I've been so focused on building an empire that I forgot to build a life. As they talked, late into the night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of genuine connection. Not the superficial networking of her professional life, but the kind of conversation that happened when two people were brave enough to be honest about their fears and hopes. When they finally said goodnight, Sarah lay in the guest bed feeling more settled than she had in months. She was still unemployed, still nearly broke, still facing an uncertain future. But for the first time since Marcus's betrayal, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Through the window, she could see the garden Emma had been so proud of. Dormant now but holding the promise of spring's renewal. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself imagine a different kind of future, one measured not by quarterly reports and stock prices, but by the quality of her relationships and the depth of her connections. It was a smaller dream than the one she'd lost, but it felt more real. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah fell asleep not with anxiety about tomorrow, but with anticipation for what it might bring. Sarah had been living in David's guest room for a week when the first complication arrived in the form of a certified letter. She'd been helping Emma with her math homework at the kitchen table, marveling at how the simple act of explaining fractions to a 9-year-old had brought her more satisfaction than most board meetings ever had. When the doorbell rang, David signed for the letter with a frown, recognizing the law firm's letterhead immediately. Sarah watched his expression change as he read, saw the color drain from his face in a way that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would be nothing good. David handed her the letter without speaking. It was from Hartwell Morrison and Associates, representing his former mother-in-law, Patricia Winters. The language was formal and cold, but the message was clear. They were challenging his custody of Emma, claiming that his living situation had become unstable and potentially harmful to the child. "They're saying I'm an unfit parent," David said, his voice hollow, "because I'm letting a stranger live in my house with my daughter." Sarah felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. "This is because of me," she said. "I should never have stayed. I should have known this would cause problems." "No," David said firmly, "this isn't your fault. Patricia has been looking for an excuse to challenge me for custody since Maria died. She's never forgiven me for not being able to save her daughter." Emma looked up from her homework, sensing the tension in the room. "What's wrong?" she asked with the intuitive concern of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions. David sat down beside his daughter, his expression carefully controlled. "Remember how I told you about Grandma Patricia? Mom's mother?" Emma nodded. "The one who lives far away and never visits. She's concerned about you," David said, choosing his words carefully. "She thinks maybe you should come live with her for a while." Sarah watched Emma's face crumple with confusion and fear. "But I don't want to live with her," Emma said. "I want to live with you. This is my home." "And it always will be," David said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm not going to let anyone take you away from me. But we might have to prove to some people that you're happy and safe here." After Emma was settled in her room with a book, David and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the letter between them like a piece of evidence in a crime neither of them had committed. "Tell me about Patricia," Sarah said. David rubbed his temples, looking older than his 36 years. "She's Maria's mother. Lost her husband when Maria was 15, raised her alone. She's not a bad person, but she's controlling. She never thought I was good enough for Maria, and when Maria got sick, she blamed me for not pushing harder for more aggressive treatment. But Maria chose to stop treatment," Sarah said, remembering what David had told her. "She did, but Patricia can't accept that. She needs someone to blame, and I'm the obvious target. David picked up the letter, scanning it again. She's been waiting for me to make a mistake, and now she thinks she's found one. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same fury she'd felt when Marcus had betrayed her. What exactly are they claiming? That I'm exhibiting poor judgment by allowing an unknown woman to live in my home with my daughter. That I'm prioritizing my own needs over Emma's well-being. That I'm unstable and potentially dangerous. That's ridiculous, Sarah said. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you and Emma could see how much you love her. Love isn't always enough in custody cases, David said grimly. They'll hire investigators, interview neighbors, look for any evidence that I'm not providing a stable environment. And having you here, no matter how innocent it is, gives them ammunition. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Then I'll leave, tonight. I'll find somewhere else to stay. Where? David asked. You don't have anywhere else to. Go. I'll figure something out, Sarah said, but they both knew it wasn't that simple. Her savings were nearly gone, her credit was ruined, and she still hadn't found a job. The few interviews she'd managed to secure had all ended the same way, with polite rejections and the growing realization that her reputation in the tech industry was more damaged than she'd understood. Running away won't solve this, David said. If anything, it'll make it look like we were hiding something. Then what do we do? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter. We fight, he said finally. We prove that Emma is happy and healthy and loved. We show them that our unconventional situation is actually working. How? I don't know yet. But I'm not giving up my daughter without a fight. The next morning, Sarah woke to find David already gone. He'd left a note explaining that he'd taken Emma to school and then gone to meet with a lawyer. Sarah was left alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd disrupted simply by accepting kindness. She found herself in Emma's room, looking at the drawings that covered every available surface. There were pictures of the three of them working on the puzzle, of Sarah helping with homework, of what appeared to be a family dinner. In Emma's 9-year-old mind, Sarah had already become part of their family. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own problems, so grateful for the refuge David had provided, that she hadn't considered how her presence might affect Emma. The little girl had already lost her mother. Now she was at risk of losing her father too, and it was Sarah's fault. Her phone rang, interrupting her spiral of guilt. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer. Sarah Chun? The voice was crisp, professional. Unfamiliar, yes? This is Jennifer Walsh from Tech Innovations Monthly. I'm calling about a story we're working on regarding Technova Solutions and the recent leadership changes. We'd like to get your perspective on the transition. Sarah's blood ran cold. I'm not interested in commenting, she said quickly. I understand this might be a difficult time, Jennifer continued, but we have some information that suggests the circumstances of your departure weren't entirely voluntary. We'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your side of the story. What kind of information? Sarah asked, despite herself. Internal documents that suggest there may have been some irregularities in the investor agreements. Financial records that don't quite add up. We've been investigating this for several weeks, and we think there's more to this story than the official narrative. Sarah felt her heart racing. I really can't discuss this. Ms. Chun, I think you should know that we're planning to publish this story with or without your cooperation. It would be in your best interest to participate. Sarah hung up the phone, her hands shaking. A journalist was investigating Marcus's takeover of Technova. If they published their findings, it would drag her back into the spotlight she'd been trying to avoid. But more importantly, it would bring unwanted attention to David and Emma at the worst possible time. She called David immediately, but it went to voicemail. She tried again and again, her anxiety growing with each unanswered call. Finally, she gave up and drove to the construction site where he worked. She found him on the third floor of a building under construction, installing drywall with the methodical precision she'd come to recognize as his signature. He was surprised to see her, but one look at her face told him something was wrong. "We need to talk," she said, glancing around at his co-workers, privately. They walked to his truck, parked in the dusty lot outside the construction site. Sarah told him about the journalist's call, watching his expression grow increasingly grim. "This is exactly what we didn't need," he said when she finished. "If this story comes out, it'll make everything worse. Patricia's lawyers will use it to prove that you're unstable, that you're bringing chaos into Emma's life." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I think I should leave. Not just your house, but the area. I should disappear until this blows over." David looked at her with something that might have been disappointment. "Is that what you want? To run away?" "I want to protect Emma," Sarah said. "I want to protect you. I've already caused enough damage." "You haven't caused any damage," David said firmly. "You've been nothing but good for Emma. She's happier than she's been since Maria died. You've brought something into our house that's been missing for a long time." "What?" "Hope," David said simply. "The possibility that families can be more than just blood relations. That love can expand to include people who aren't related by genetics." Sarah felt tears threatening. "That's a beautiful thought, but it's not practical. The courts won't see it that way." "Maybe not," David admitted. "But I'd rather fight for what we have than give up without trying. What if we lose? Then we lose," David said. "But at least we'll have tried to do the right thing." Sarah looked at this man who'd shown her kindness when she'd needed it most, who'd welcomed her into his home and his family, who was now willing to risk everything to protect what they'd built together. She thought about the scared, exhausted woman who'd been sleeping in her car just a week ago, and the person she'd become in the safety of David's home. "Okay," she said finally, "we fight. But we do it smart. We need to get ahead of this story. Control the narrative before it controls us." "What do you mean?" "I mean we tell the truth before someone else tells a version of it," Sarah said. "I call that journalist back and give her an interview. I tell her exactly what happened with Marcus, exactly how I ended up in your guest room, exactly why I'm not going anywhere." David studied her face. "Are you sure?" "Once you do that, there's no going back. Your story will be public." "It's already public," Sarah said. "The difference is whether I get to tell it myself or let someone else tell it for me." That afternoon, Sarah called Jennifer Walsh back. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where Sarah could control the conversation. She spent the hours before the meeting preparing, not with spin or corporate talking points, but with the simple truth of what had happened. Jennifer Walsh was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her late 20s, with the eager energy of someone who'd stumbled onto a story that could make her career. She had a recorder and a notebook, and she launched into questions immediately. "Let's start with the basics," Jennifer said. "How long were you CEO of Technova Solutions?" 8 years, Sarah said. "I founded the company with my business partner, Marcus Fleming, in 2015. And what led to your departure?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Marcus systematically diluted my shares over several years through complex legal maneuvers I wasn't paying attention to. When he brought in investors, they weren't just buying into the company, they were buying his majority stake. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd been voted out of the company I built." Jennifer's eyes lit up. "Do you have documentation of this?" "Some," Sarah said. "But more importantly, I have the truth. Marcus Fleming betrayed a trust. That went back to college. He used my focus on product development and my trust in him to gradually steal my company." "That's a serious allegation." "It's also true," Sarah said, "and I'm not afraid to say it on the record. They talked for 2 hours, Sarah answering every question with the kind of honesty she'd never shown in a business context. She talked about the financial ruin, the emotional devastation, the way success had isolated her from real human connection. She talked about sleeping in her car and the shame of accepting charity. "How did you end up in your current living situation?" Jennifer asked. Sarah smiled, thinking of David and Emma. "I met someone who reminded me that kindness isn't charity. It's humanity. Someone who showed me that there are different ways to measure success, different ways to build a life. And now you're facing a custody battle that could affect that relationship." "I'm facing a custody battle because someone thinks that unconventional families are inherently unstable," Sarah said. "But I've learned more about family in the past week than I learned in 34 years of chasing conventional success." "What's next for you?" Sarah considered the question. "I'm not sure yet. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not defined by my job title. But I know that I want to build something different this time. Something that's measured by the quality of relationships rather than the size of bank accounts." When the interview was over, Sarah felt drained but also strangely liberated. She'd told her story without spin, without trying to manage her image or protect her reputation. She'd been honest about her failures and her fears, and it felt like the first authentic conversation she'd had with a journalist in years. She drove back to David's house where she found him and Emma working in the garden. They'd been preparing the soil for spring planting, and Emma was explaining to her father which vegetables they should grow. "How did it go?" David asked, looking up from the dirt. "Better than expected," Sarah said. "I told the truth, all of it." "Are you nervous about the article?" Sarah considered the question. Strangely, no. "I'm tired of being afraid of what people will think. I'm tired of managing my image instead of living my life." Emma looked up from the seedling she was examining. "What article?" "A reporter is writing a story about Sarah's old company," David explained. "About what happened to her. Will it help people understand that you're not a bad person?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. Sarah knelt down beside the little girl, touched by her instinctive understanding. "I hope so. But more importantly, it'll help me understand that I'm not a bad person." "You're not," Emma said firmly. "You're one of the good ones. Dad says there are good people and bad people, and you can tell the difference by how they treat others when they don't have to." Sarah looked at David, who was watching his daughter with obvious pride. "Your dad is very smart." "He is," Emma agreed. "And he says you're staying with us no matter what some mean lady says." "Emma," David said gently, "we've talked about this. Sarah might have to leave if the judge thinks it's better for you." "But that's stupid," Emma said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Sarah makes you happy, and she makes me happy. And we make her happy. Why would someone want to break that up?" Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be," she said. "Then maybe adults should act more like kids," Emma said matter-of-factly. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Sarah and David sat in the living room, another puzzle spread out on the coffee table. This one was more challenging, abstract design in blues and purples that seemed to shift and change as they worked on it. "Are you having second thoughts?" David asked, fitting a piece into place. "About the interview? About staying? About fighting this custody battle? About getting involved in our mess?" Sarah looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "David, this isn't your mess. This is life. Complicated, messy, unpredictable life. And I'd rather be living it with you and Emma than hiding from it somewhere else." "Even if we lose?" "Even if we lose," Sarah said. "But I don't think we will." "Emma is right. What we have is good, and sometimes good is enough." David reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "I'm scared," he admitted. "So am I," Sarah said. "But I'm also hopeful. For the first time in months, I'm hopeful." They worked on the puzzle in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same piece. Sarah found herself thinking about how different this was from her old life, where every interaction had been calculated, where every relationship had been a transaction. "Can I ask you something?" she said, always. "Do you think this is what Maria would want? For you to risk losing Emma to help someone you barely know?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I think Maria would want me to do what I thought was right," he said finally. "And I think she'd want Emma to grow up in a world where people help each other, where love isn't limited by convention or law. And if the courts don't see it that way, then we'll deal with that when it happens," David said. "But I'm not going to live my life based on what other people might think or do. I'm going to live it based on what I know is right." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition of the strength it took to live with such integrity. "I've spent so many years worried about what other people thought," she said. "I made every decision based on how it would look, how it would affect my reputation, how it would advance my career. And now? Now I'm learning that the only opinion that really matters is my own," Sarah said. "And I know that what we have here is worth fighting for." The next morning brought another complication. Sarah woke to find David in the kitchen, holding his phone with a grim expression. "What now?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "My lawyer called. Patricia's legal team has requested an emergency hearing. They want to remove Emma from my custody immediately, pending a full investigation." Sarah felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. "When?" "Friday, 3 days from now." "That's not enough time to prepare." "No," David agreed. "It's not, but it's what we have." Sarah poured herself coffee with shaking hands. "What does your lawyer say?" "That we need character witnesses. People who can testify that I'm a good father, that Emma is happy and healthy, that our living situation is stable and appropriate." "Do you have people who would do that?" David nodded. "Some. My foreman, Emma's teacher, a few neighbors, but it might not be enough." Sarah set down her coffee cup and turned to face him. "Then we make sure it's enough. We prepare for this hearing like it's the most important presentation of our lives." "Our lives?" "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said firmly. "If they want to tear apart this family, they'll have to do it with me fighting alongside you." David looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not just gratitude, but love. Real love, the kind that wasn't based on what she could do for him or what she could achieve, but on who she was when all the pretenses were stripped away. "I love you," he said quietly. Sarah felt her breath catch. "I love you too," she said, and realized it was the first time she'd said those words and meant them completely. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, knowing that everything was about to change. The article about Technova would be published soon, bringing unwanted attention and scrutiny. The custody hearing would determine whether they'd be allowed to continue building their unconventional family. The future was uncertain and frightening. But for the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't facing uncertainty alone. She was facing it with people who loved her not for what she'd achieved, but for who she was becoming. And that, she realized, was a kind of success she'd never imagined, but had always been searching for. The complications were mounting, the stakes were rising, and the battle for their family was about to begin. But Sarah had learned something important in the past week. The strongest foundations weren't built on certainty or control, but on love and trust and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. And what mattered most was the life they'd built together, one honest conversation and one completed puzzle at a time. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain, and Sarah found herself gripping the iron railing as she climbed toward the entrance. David walked beside her, his hand steady on her back, while Emma held tightly to his other hand. The little girl had insisted on coming, despite David's attempts to shield her from the proceedings. I want to tell them I'm happy, Emma had said that morning, her jaw set with determination that reminded Sarah of her father. I want to tell them I don't want to live with someone I don't know. Sarah's article had been published 2 days earlier, and the response had been swift and polarizing. Her phone had buzzed constantly with interview requests, job offers, and messages of support from strangers who'd read her story. But it had also brought Patricia's legal team out in full force, painting Sarah as an unstable influence who was using David's kindness to rebuild her damaged reputation. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Patricia Winters sat in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy suit immaculate. She looked every inch the successful businesswoman she was, and Sarah could see why a judge might find her arguments compelling. Patricia's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Rebecca Hart, presented their case with clinical precision. David Martinez, she argued, had shown poor judgment in allowing a complete stranger to live in his home with his vulnerable daughter, Sarah. Chun, she continued, was a failed businesswoman who'd lost everything and was now taking advantage of a grieving widower's generosity. Your Honor, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, Mr. Martinez may believe he's helping someone in need, but he's actually putting his daughter at risk. Miss Chun has no permanent address, no stable income, and no background check. She's essentially a homeless person who's manipulated her way into this family's life. Sarah felt David's hand find hers under the table, his grip warm and reassuring. She'd expected the attack, had prepared for it, but hearing her life reduced to those harsh terms still stung. David's lawyer, a kind-faced man named Robert Chun, who'd taken their case pro bono, stood to present their defense. He called character witnesses who testified to David's devotion as a father, to Emma's happiness and well-being, to the stability of their home environment. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, spoke about the remarkable improvement in Emma's confidence and joy since Sarah had entered their lives. Emma talks about Sarah constantly, she said. She's excited about helping with homework, about family dinners, about having someone new to share her art with. I've never seen her so animated. David's foreman testified about his work ethic and reliability, about the way he'd balanced single parenthood with professional responsibilities. Neighbors spoke about the laughter that had returned to the house, about the way Emma had started playing outside again, about the sense of family that had been restored. But it was Emma herself who provided the most powerful testimony. The judge had initially been reluctant to allow a 9-year-old to speak, but Emma's determination had won out. She sat in the witness chair, her legs swinging slightly, her voice clear and strong. Sarah makes us happy, she said simply. She helps me with my homework, and she listens when I tell her about my day. She doesn't try to replace my mom, but she makes our house feel like a home again. Emma, Patricia's lawyer said during cross-examination, don't you think it might be nice to live with your grandmother? To have someone who knew your mother take care of you? Emma considered this seriously. I think it would be sad, she said finally. Grandma Patricia is nice, but she lives far away from my friends and my school and my dad. And she doesn't know about my art or my favorite books or how I like my sandwiches cut. But she's your family, Rebecca pressed. So is Sarah, Emma said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. Family isn't just about being related. It's about loving each other and taking care of each other. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Helen Morrison, listened to everything with the patient attention of someone who'd seen too many broken families. When it came time for closing arguments, Rebecca Hart painted a picture of a man whose judgment had been compromised by loneliness and a woman who was taking advantage of his vulnerability. Your Honor, she said, we're not questioning Mr. Martinez's love for his daughter. We're questioning his ability to make sound decisions about her welfare. Allowing a stranger to live in his home, to become involved in his daughter's daily life. shows a dangerous lack of judgment. Robert Chun's response was simple and direct. Your Honor, love takes many forms. The love this family has found may be unconventional, but it's real. Emma is thriving, David is providing a stable home, and Sarah has become a positive influence in their lives. To tear this family apart now would be to punish them for finding joy after loss. When the arguments were finished, Judge Morrison called for a recess. Sarah, David, and Emma sat in the hallway, the weight of waiting heavy between them. Other families passed by, some celebrating victories, others dealing with defeats, all of them navigating the complex terrain of family law. Whatever happens, David said quietly, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest I've been since Maria died. For me too, Sarah said, surprising herself with the truth of it. I thought happiness was about achievement, about reaching goals and winning competitions. But it's actually about sitting in a courthouse hallway with people who love you, knowing that you're fighting for something that matters. Emma leaned against Sarah's shoulder. Are you scared? She asked. Yes, Sarah admitted. But I'm also hopeful. Because no matter what the judge decides, I know that what we have is real. When they were called back into the courtroom, Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. She looked at the three of them sitting together at the defendant's table, at Patricia sitting alone behind the plaintiff's table, at the lawyers who'd argued their cases with professional detachment. This is a difficult decision, she began. I've listened to testimony about a man who's clearly devoted to his daughter, about a child who's thriving in her current environment, and about a woman who's found herself in an unusual situation. Sarah felt her heart pounding as the judge continued. I've also heard concerns about stability, about the appropriateness of the living arrangement, about the potential impact on the child's welfare. These are valid concerns that deserve careful consideration. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression hopeful. However, Judge Morrison continued, I'm also mindful that families come in many forms. The nuclear family is not the only model for raising healthy, happy children. What matters is love, stability, and the child's best interests. She looked directly at Emma. I was particularly moved by Emma's testimony. She's clearly a bright, articulate child who knows her own mind. And what she's told me is that she's happy, that she feels loved and secure, and that she considers Sarah to be part of her family. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. I'm also impressed by the testimony of Emma's teacher and neighbors about the positive changes they've observed since Sarah joined the household. A child's happiness and well-being are the most important factors in any custody decision. Judge Morrison paused, her gaze moving between the two legal teams. That being said, I do have concerns about the long-term stability of this arrangement. Ms. Chun is currently unemployed and has no permanent housing situation beyond Mr. Martinez's generosity. While I don't question her intentions or her positive impact on this family, I need to ensure that Emma's future remains secure. Sarah's heart sank. She'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it articulated by the judge made it feel final. Therefore, Judge Morrison continued, I'm going to order a 6-month review period. Emma will remain in her father's custody, but I want to see evidence of increased stability in the household. This means Miss Chun needs to find permanent employment and establish her own residence, even if she continues to spend time with the family. Patricia's lawyer started to object, but Judge Morrison raised her hand. I'm not finished. I'm also ordering family counseling for all parties involved, including Miss Chun, if she chooses to participate. And I want regular reports from Emma's school about her continued well-being and academic progress. She looked at each of them in turn. I believe that love is the foundation of any healthy family, but love alone isn't enough. Children need stability, security, and consistency. If this family can demonstrate those qualities over the next 6 months, I'll be happy to make this arrangement permanent. Sarah felt a complex mix of relief and anxiety. They'd won, but conditionally. Emma would stay with David, but Sarah's place in their family remained uncertain. Outside the courthouse, Patricia approached them for the first time that day. She looked older than she had in the courtroom, more fragile, and Sarah could see the grief that had been driving her legal challenge. "I'm not giving up," she said to David, but her voice lacked conviction. "Patricia," David said gently, "Emma needs stability, not another custody battle. If you want to be part of her life, we can work something out. But this isn't the way." Patricia looked at Emma, who was holding both Sarah's and David's hands. "She does look happy," she admitted reluctantly. "I am happy," Emma said. "But I'd be happier if you visited us sometimes. Dad has pictures of you and Mom when she was little. I'd like to hear those stories." Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "I just miss her so much," she said. "Maria was all I had left of her father. She's still here," David said. "In Emma, in the memories we share. But you can't bring her back by taking Emma away from the life she's built." As they walked away from the courthouse, Sarah felt the weight of the judge's conditions settling on her shoulders. She needed to find a job, needed to establish her own residence, needed to prove that she could contribute to the family stability rather than threaten it. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a quiet dinner, Sarah broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I need to start looking for an apartment," she said. The judge was clear about that. Emma looked up from her spaghetti with alarm. "But you just got here," she protested. "I'll still be around," Sarah promised. "I'll just have my own place." "That's what the judge wants to see. What about a job?" David asked. "Any responses to your applications?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing serious. I think the article helped in some ways, but it also made me controversial. Some companies don't want to deal with the publicity. Then maybe it's time to stop looking for the job you used to have and start looking for the job you want to have," David suggested. Sarah considered this. "I'm not sure I know what that is anymore. What made you happy about your work before everything went wrong?" Emma asked with the insight that sometimes came from children. Sarah thought about it. "The early days," she said finally, "when we were solving problems, creating something new, helping people do their work better. Before it became about profit margins and market share and proving ourselves to investors." "So do that again," Emma said simply, "but smaller, better." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into job hunting with new purpose. Instead of applying for executive positions at large corporations, she began looking for opportunities to work with small businesses, nonprofits, and startups. She offered her services as a consultant, helping organizations optimize their technology without the overhead of corporate bureaucracy. Her first client was a local community center that needed help managing their volunteer database. The pay was minimal, but the work was satisfying in a way that corporate consulting had never been. She could see the immediate impact of her efforts, could work directly with the people who would benefit from the improvements she made. Word spread quickly through the network of small organizations that always needed technology help, but couldn't afford expensive consultants. Sarah found herself building a client base of nonprofits, family-owned businesses, and community organizations that valued her expertise and appreciated her reasonable rates. 3 months after the custody hearing, Sarah was able to afford a small apartment across town. It was nothing like her previous penthouse, but it was hers. She furnished it simply, with pieces that prioritized comfort over status, and she found that she preferred it to the showcase she'd once called home. The apartment became a symbol of her transformation. It was a place where she could be herself, without pretense, where she could invite David and Emma for dinner without worrying about impressing anyone. It was a home built on authenticity rather than achievement. The 6-month review hearing arrived with less fanfare than the original custody battle. Patricia's legal team made a perfunctory argument about the ongoing unconventional nature of the arrangement, but their heart wasn't in it. Patricia herself had begun visiting Emma regularly, building a relationship based on genuine affection rather than legal obligation. Judge Morrison reviewed the reports from Emma's school, all of which praised her continued academic progress and emotional well-being. She examined Sarah's employment records, her stable housing situation, and the family counseling reports that documented the healthy dynamics between all parties. "I'm satisfied that this arrangement is working in Emma's best interests," she concluded. "The temporary custody order is hereby made permanent. Mr. Martinez retains full custody, with regular visitation rights for Mrs. Winters." As they left the courthouse for the final time, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal victory. She'd found her place in the world, not by rebuilding her old life, but by building a new one based on different values and priorities. That night, they celebrated with ice cream and Emma's favorite movie. As they sat on the couch, Emma curled between Sarah and David, Sarah realized that this was what success actually looked like. Not the magazine covers or the speaking engagements or the corporate achievements, but this quiet moment of love and contentment. "I have something to tell you," David said during a commercial break. Sarah looked at him expectantly. "I've been thinking about what you said about building something new, something smaller and better. I've been talking to some of the other guys at work, and we're thinking about starting our own construction company, focusing on sustainable building, working with families instead of big developers." Sarah smiled. "That sounds perfect." "It would mean less money, at least at first," David warned. "Money isn't everything," Sarah said, and meant it. "Sometimes the best things are the ones that can't be bought." Emma looked up at both of them. "Are you going to get married?" she asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Sarah and David looked at each other, both laughing at the unexpected question. "Would you want us to?" David asked his daughter. Emma considered this seriously. "I think so," she said finally. "Then we'd be a real family officially, not just in our hearts." Sarah felt tears of joy gathering in her eyes. "We're already a real family," she said. "We have been since the night your dad found me in that parking lot." As they finished the movie, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost everything that had once defined her success, but she'd found something more valuable than any corporate achievement. She'd found a family, a purpose, and a version of herself that was authentic and whole. The crisis had transformed her, had shown her that strength wasn't about avoiding failure, but about how you responded to it. She'd learned that love wasn't a transaction but a gift, that family wasn't about blood but about choice, and that success wasn't about what you accomplished, but about who you became in the process. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn and build. But tonight, surrounded by the people who loved her for who she was rather than what she'd achieved, Sarah knew that she'd already won the only competition that mattered. She'd won the right to be happy, to be loved, and to be home. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the backyard of David's house, watching Emma carefully arrange wildflowers in mason jars. The garden they'd planted together that spring was in full bloom, a riot of color and life that seemed to mirror the transformation that had taken place in all their lives. "The yellow ones go in the middle," Emma instructed, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "Mom always said yellow was the color of happiness." Sarah smiled, adjusting a particularly stubborn sunflower. "Your mom was right about a lot of things." They were preparing for a small celebration, nothing fancy, just a gathering of the people who'd become their chosen family over the past year. Sarah's consulting business had grown steadily, built on referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients. She'd never made as much money as she had at Technova, but she'd never been happier with her work. David emerged from the house carrying a folding table, his new business partner Jake trailing behind with chairs. David's sustainable construction company had taken off faster than any of them had expected, fueled by a growing demand for environmentally conscious building practices and the reputation for quality that David had built over years of meticulous work. "Are you sure we need all these tables?" Jake asked, surveying the modest backyard. "Trust me," Emma said with authority. "When Mrs. Rodriguez brings her famous enchiladas, we'll need every inch of space." Sarah watched the easy camaraderie between the men, the way David had found his professional calling just as she'd found hers. They'd both learned that success wasn't about the size of your empire, but about the quality of what you built and the people you built it with. The doorbell chimed, and Emma raced to answer it, returning with Mrs. Rodriguez and her husband, followed by several of Emma's classmates and their parents. The backyard gradually filled with laughter and conversation. Children playing tag around the vegetable garden, while adults shared stories and homemade food. Patricia arrived fashionably late, as always, carrying a beautifully wrapped present and wearing a smile that had become increasingly genuine over the months. Her relationship with Emma had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, built on shared stories about Maria and Patricia's newfound appreciation for the life David had built for his daughter. "Where's the guest of honor?" Patricia asked, embracing Emma warmly. "Sarah's inside, getting the cake," Emma said, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "She's really nervous about the speech." Sarah was indeed nervous, though not about the speech she'd been asked to give. Tonight wasn't just about celebrating her consulting business or David's new company. Tonight was about something much more significant, something that would formalize what had been true in their hearts for months. Robert Chun, the lawyer who'd represented them in the custody battle, arrived with his wife and teenage daughter. He'd become a friend over the past year, helping Sarah navigate the legal complexities of starting her own business and advising David on the formation of his construction company. "How does it feel to be the woman of the hour?" Robert asked, accepting a glass of lemonade from David. "Terrifying," Sarah admitted. "I'm not used to celebrating things that can't be measured in quarterly reports." "That's the beauty of it," Robert said. "Some of the most important achievements in life can't be quantified." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, David called for everyone's attention. The gathering quieted, faces turning toward him expectantly. "A year ago," David began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that Sarah had come to love, "I thought I knew what my life would look like. I thought I had it all figured out, that Emma and I would just continue on the path we'd been walking since Maria died." He paused, his gaze finding Sarah in the crowd. "But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them, when you're brave enough to help a stranger or accept help from someone you've never met." Sarah felt her cheeks warm as the assembled friends and neighbors turned to look at her. "Sarah came into our lives at a moment when we didn't even know we needed her," David continued. "She brought light into our home, laughter into our days, and hope into our hearts. She showed Emma that families can grow in unexpected ways, and she showed me that love isn't something you run out of. It's something that multiplies when you share it." Emma bounced on her toes, clearly struggling to contain her excitement. "But more than that," David said, his voice growing stronger, "Sarah taught me that strength isn't about carrying everything alone. It's about being vulnerable enough to let someone help you, brave enough to help someone else, and wise enough to know the difference between what you can control and what you have to trust." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Sarah Chen," David said, dropping to one knee in front of her, "you've already been part of our family for a year. You've been Emma's second mother, my partner in everything that matters, and my best friend. Will you make it official? Will you marry me?" The backyard erupted in cheers before Sarah could even respond. Emma was jumping up and down, clapping her hands together, while Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah looked down at David, at this man who'd found her at her lowest point and loved her back to life, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." David slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple band with a small diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. It wasn't the largest or most expensive ring Sarah had ever seen, but it was perfect because it came from love rather than obligation, from choice rather than expectation. As their friends and neighbors surrounded them with congratulations and well wishes, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost everything she'd thought mattered, only to discover that what actually mattered had been waiting for her all along. Emma wrapped her arms around both of them, creating a three-person hug that felt like coming home. "Does this mean I get to call you Mom?" she asked Sarah. Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "If you want to," she said. "But I hope you know that I've already been thinking of you as my daughter for months." "I know," Emma said with the wisdom of a child who'd learned to recognize love in all its forms. "I could tell." As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Sarah found herself alone with David and Emma in the backyard, surrounded by the detritus of celebration and the warmth of a perfect summer night. "I have something for you," Emma said, disappearing into the house and returning with a wrapped package. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing a hand-painted picture frame containing a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed the three of them working out a puzzle together, their heads bent in concentration, their faces soft with contentment. David must have taken it without her noticing. "I made the frame myself," Emma explained proudly. "And I wrote something on the back." Sarah turned the frame over and read the inscription in Emma's careful handwriting. For Sarah, who taught me that families aren't just made of people who look alike. They're made of people who choose to love each other. "Thank you for choosing us." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. "Emma, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." "It's true though," Emma said matter-of-factly. "You did choose us. And we chose you back." Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed and they'd finished cleaning up, Sarah and David sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night?" Sarah asked. David considered this. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said. "Maybe not that night, maybe not in that parking lot, but somehow, some things are meant to be." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I used to think that was naive," she said. "The idea that things happen for a reason, that love conquers all. I thought success was about controlling outcomes, about making things happen through force of will. And now? Now I think the most important things in life can't be controlled or conquered," Sarah said. "They can only be received with gratitude and protected with care." David pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love the woman you've become," he said. "But I also love the woman you were when I first met you. Scared and proud and broken and beautiful." "I was such a mess," Sarah laughed, remembering the woman who'd been sleeping in her car just a year ago. "You were human," David corrected. "And you were exactly who you needed to be to find your way to us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Sarah thought about the choices that had led her here, the failures and losses that had stripped away everything she'd thought she wanted and revealed what she'd actually needed. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about the night we met." David waited, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I wasn't just driving aimlessly," Sarah continued. "I was thinking about ending it, not dramatically, not as a cry for help, but just stopping. I was so tired of fighting, so tired of pretending I was okay when everything was falling apart." David's hand tightened around hers, but he didn't speak. When you knocked on my window, when you offered to help, it was the first time in months that anyone had seen me. Really seen me. Not the successful CEO or the fallen executive or the cautionary tale, but just a person who needed help. I'm glad I stopped, David said quietly. So am I, Sarah said. Because that night taught me that rock bottom isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning of the best chapter you'll ever write. 6 months later, they were married in the same backyard where David had proposed, surrounded by the garden they'd planted together and the friends who'd become their chosen family. Emma served as the maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd helped design and carrying a bouquet of flowers from their own garden. Sarah's vows were simple and honest, speaking of gratitude rather than grand promises, of the quiet miracle of finding love when you'd given up looking for it. David's vows spoke of second chances and the courage to build something new on the foundation of loss and hope. Patricia walked Emma down the aisle, the two of them having formed a bond that honored Maria's memory while creating something entirely new. Robert Chun officiated, his legal expertise lending weight to the ceremony, while his friendship added warmth. As they exchanged rings, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago, driven by ambition and hollow success, measuring her worth by other people's standards. That woman had needed to fall apart completely before she could be rebuilt into someone capable of this kind of love. The reception was held in the community center where Sarah had found her first consulting client, the same place where she'd learned that meaningful work didn't require corporate titles or six-figure salaries. It required only the desire to help others and the skills to make a difference. During the father-daughter dance, Sarah watched David and Emma move together with the easy grace of two people who'd learned to lean on each other. When the song ended, Emma gestured for Sarah to join them, and they finished the dance as a family of 3. I have something to tell you, Emma whispered as they swayed together. I'm writing a book about us. A book? Sarah asked, surprised. It's about a girl whose dad finds a lady sleeping in her car, and how they all become a family. Emma explained. I'm calling it The Night Everything Changed. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and love. I think that's a perfect title, she said. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway of the community center, looking out at the life she'd built. Her consulting business had grown into something sustainable and meaningful, working with organizations that aligned with her values rather than chasing the highest bidder. David's construction company had become known for its integrity and craftsmanship, building homes that would last generations and using methods that honored the environment. Together, they'd created a life that was smaller than what Sarah had once imagined for herself, but infinitely richer. Ready to go home? David asked, appearing beside her with their coats. Home, Sarah repeated, savoring the word. I never really understood what that meant before I met you. What does it mean now? Sarah looked at Emma, who was carefully packing away the leftover cake, and at David, who was watching her with the patient love that had become as essential to her as breathing. It means having people who love you not for what you've achieved, but for who you are, she said. It means having a place where you can be completely yourself, where failure doesn't define you and success doesn't isolate you. And what does success mean now? David asked. Sarah smiled, thinking of the sleeping woman in the Mercedes who'd been too proud to ask for help, too scared to admit she was drowning. Success means being brave enough to accept love when it's offered, wise enough to offer it when it's needed, and grateful enough to recognize the difference between what you want and what you need. They drove home through the quiet streets, Emma asleep in the back seat, her head pillowed on Sarah's bouquet. The house that had once sheltered a broken woman now welcomed a wife and mother, someone who'd learned that the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or on magazine covers, but in the quiet moments between people who'd chosen to love each other. As Sarah hung her wedding dress in the closet beside David's suits and Emma's school clothes, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost everything that had once defined her, but she'd found something infinitely more valuable. A family that had been built not on obligation or expectation, but on choice and love and the radical act of showing up for each other every single day. The woman who'd once measured her worth by her net worth now measured it by the depth of her relationships, the authenticity of her work, and the quality of the love she gave and received. It was a different kind of success, one that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports or celebrated in magazine articles, but it was real and lasting and true. And as she settled into bed beside the man who'd found her at her lowest point and loved her back to life, Sarah knew that sometimes the most important journeys began not with a destination in mind, but with the courage to accept help from a stranger in a parking lot on a rainy night. The end of one story had become the beginning of another, and this one, Sarah knew, would last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.